Hi, we're Césars. You probably know us from Jerk It Out. And... oh wait, that's probably it. Well, if you keep watching this video, then that's about to change. In 2005, Jerk It Out became almost ever present on American TV screens through its use in an iPod Shuffle commercial. It was a pretty decent hit in the rest of the world as well, and the song lives on through its continued use in not just commercials, but also movies and movie trailers, TV shows, video games, and, well, memes.
Let's go!
But Jerk It Out's success hasn't led to a substantial amount of people checking out the rest of César's catalogue. Outside of Sweden, the band's home country, Jerk It Out is their only single to chart in the top 100 of these national charts here. Even in the UK, where it managed to be a top 10 hit, none of their other songs have come within spitting distance of the top 50. Before this year, I also hadn't heard any César songs aside from Jerk It Out and their cover of Don't Fear the Reaper, which I listened to once, like 12 years ago. I'll just say right now, I'm kicking myself for not listening to the rest of their stuff sooner. But I also wanted to make this video because the band had a fairly unexpected trajectory leading to Jerk It Out becoming a hit. Plus, one of the guys in the band did some other stuff that you may have heard before without realizing. So hopefully you'll be learning some fun facts as well as discovering some good music that you hadn't heard before through this video. Now, the channel Rock and Roll True Stories already posted a video earlier this year about the success of Jerk It Out, which did also cover the background of César a bit as well. But even before I found out about that other video, I was doing my best to ensure that this video would be by far the most comprehensive guide to César's. So who exactly is César's, and what does their music sound like outside of that one song that you already know? Well, without further ado, let's go! The story of César's begins with the lead singer, a half-Portuguese Stockholmian named Augusto Paulo César de Souza Vidal. Mercifully, he's just known as César Vidal, or César Vidal because I don't think Swedish has that accent in it. In the early 90s, he pursued a solo career, calling himself Mr. Vidal, but after dismissing some less than satisfactory backing musicians with another gig coming up, he then turned to some close friends. The closest of those being Joakim Åhlund, whom he'd known since the pair were 2 years old. Åhlund had mostly been a bass player at this point, but in this band he instead took up lead guitar and brought in David Lindqvist to play bass. David subsequently brought in one of his old bandmates, Jens Öjeheim, to play drums, and what may have initially been a continuation of the Mr. Vidal project soon became a fully fledged band. That band christened itself as César's Palace. A lot of subsequent biographies about César's claim that the band formed in 1995, but the 1998 article from Swedish magazine Sound Effects that I got all that stuff about Vidal's solo career from says that César's Palace formed in 1993. But 1995 was the year of the band's debut release, a 3-song single called Shake It, which apparently originated from Åhlund sending the band's demo tape to the Gothenburg-based label Dolores Recordings, and the label immediately turning that demo into the single. Then the following year they would put out the debut César's Palace EP. And if you're in a Spanish-speaking household, then make sure the kids are out of the room for this, because that EP was called Rock de Puta Mierda. The band was still very much underground at this point, though they did get reviews from the American zine Maximum Rock and Roll, including a review of their debut single that said something like, "This is good stuff if you like to annoy your neighbors." The Shake It single is pure garage rock with pounding drums, ripping guitars, and Vidal largely alternating between sneering and shouting. Meanwhile, you could almost pass off Rock de Puta Mierda as a recording from an actual 70s punk rock band, both in terms of its often blaring high-tempo nature and the fact that it sounds like it was recorded in a shed. Vidal's vocals are less aggressive on the EP, though whilst the instruments sound like they were recorded using standard microphones, the vocals sound like they were recorded into a cheap handheld tape recorder. In that sound effects interview, Åhlund apparently confirms that he produced that EP himself, and was quite unhappy with the results. So when César's Palace were working on their debut album, Youth is Wasted on the Young, Åhlund instead brought in his younger brother Klaas to oversee the recordings. With Klaas Åhlund's help, Youth is Wasted on the Young is of noticeably higher fidelity than the preceding EP. The album most likely first dropped in 1998, though Discogs lists the oldest versions of the album as being released in 1997. The recording of the album taking place in fall 1997 in Stockholm, and the copyright year of the album being 98, makes me very skeptical of that. On the other hand, when the album eventually got a second vinyl pressing by the label Busy Bee, they referred to it as the band's 1997 debut album. One version of the album that definitely debuted in 1998 was the United States version, distributed via indie label Minty Fresh. However, America is also home to the original Caesar's Palace, so a name change was required, and thus the band went to the much more familiar name of the 12 Caesars. Would you be shocked to hear that American indie rock fans didn't appreciate that timely ancient history reference? According to Åhlund, the band's original suggestion was to change their name to the Caesarians, and the label was just like, ew, no. Now let's finally get into the music on this album. And if those earlier Caesar's Palace releases almost sounded like a completely different band compared to the one that did Jerk It Out, then we're already getting into more familiar territory with this album's lead single, I'm Gonna Kick You Out.
Gonna kick you out and let the sun shine in. Kick you out and let the sun shine in.
So, between Rock to Puta Mierda and this album, there were two major turning points. The first is that Åhlund started providing backing vocals, which weren't a part of the earlier Caesar's Palace releases because, according to him, he hadn't learned how to properly play guitar and sing at the same time yet. The second turning point was Åhlund gaining access to a Farfisa organ. So the introduction of both vocal harmonies and a very retro-sounding fuzzy organ pushed Caesar's Palace into a much more psychedelic direction. However, while Kick You Out and Jerk It Out use the same instrumentation, Kick You Out instead has a bitter vocal line, and the music comes off less buoyant and more swampy. Also, check out this line.
Back beyond, a man with a bow in a world of soup.
Yeah, you thought that Noel Gallagher came up with that line, didn't you? Noel said that about his brother Liam in April 2009, about 4 months before Oasis split up. Guess which band opened for Oasis during their Scandinavian shows earlier that year? This might not be a huge revelation given that Noel Gallagher has a bit of a reputation for borrowing other people's existing ideas. And to be fair, Åhlund likely didn't come up with the line himself either, because Trouser Press points out that the line also appears in the 1995 movie Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead. It's nice to finally hear some other effects mixed into the music aside from just distortion. So there's a fair amount of reverb now, there's also quite a lot of tremolo effect, and these two things go into absolute overdrive on the track Susie Cream Cheese. That track is a cover of a cult 60s single by a short-lived American band called Teddy and His Patches.
You see the strobe light flashing.
You see the strobe flashing, and hear the music.
Not only does this album broaden the band's instrumentation a fair bit, but also, whilst I wouldn't say there isn't any catchiness at all to the earlier releases, Åhlund's hook writing abilities improved tenfold on this album.
Let's go pumpkin, baby. Stay out all night.
Though there's a veneer of sleaze to this album that more or less goes away on the band's later albums. I'd say that's down to a mixture of more thrashy guitar moments, the more raw old-school garage-style drumming, Vidal's vocals being a bit closer to a nasal whine compared to their later stuff, and the lyrics generally being a bit more dark overall.
'Cause I know just how to use you, not play you like a fool.
On Sorted Out, the album's other single, they proclaim their belief that the only way to get over a recent breakup is by smoking crack, shooting speedballs, and sniffing glue. If there's love involved, then it's either dysfunctional, like on My Abduction Love and Let's Go Parking Baby, or it's not actually love at all, like on You're My Favorite. Being a band singing in English as their second language, their lyrics tend to generally just be competent. But on You're My Favorite, there are some brilliantly savage lines.
When I feel ugly, I just look at you. You're always my second choice.
And I guess they're pretty proud of the song because they first have the original version, and then they have an alternate acoustic version later on the album. Oh, and it originally appeared on their EP as well. Youth is Wasted on the Young is some great power garage pop, though still not quite as radio-friendly as some of their later stuff would be. P.S. My Abduction Love is now called My Abduction Song on streaming services, and I don't know if the band itself requested that name change, or if the label just doesn't give a shit anymore. By the time Caesar's Palace were recording their next album, Jens Urjeheim had been replaced on drums. This was Jens's decision, as in a later interview he pointed out that he didn't enjoy being a drummer anymore, so he quit the band in 1998. He later formed a damn near ungoogleable band named Forest, who released an album in 2011, which is what that interview was promoting, but that seems to be the band's only release to this day. Also, apparently the Wall Street Journal interviewed him about PewDiePie. His son was a fan, but he most definitely was not. That was from 2014, and that's the most recent update I can find about him. His replacement was Nino Keller, who might be the most Al Pacino-looking guy I've seen this side of, well, Al Pacino. Not only are the other guys in the band known Keller since high school, but apparently this was the second band that they'd formed together. The first band was called Helicopter, and there's exactly one Helicopter song out there on a 1994 compilation called G Rock Around the Clock. Their contribution to the album was called Eat Cheese. Anyway, let's jump ahead to 2000 when Caesar's Palace released their second album and first album with Nino Keller called Cherry Kicks. The lead single from the album was Fun and Games, and based on that cover art you might think this is going to be another song with a bit of an edge to it. Well, here's how it sounds.
You're a young girl and you're living out on your own.
Fun and Games is another cover, this time of a 70s Jamaican reggae single by Junior Biles. And Caesar's Palace keep their approach to the song fairly lighthearted as well. Even the keyboard solo is played on a more mellow-sounding organ. Being asked to mime the song on this Swedish TV appearance made the band a little less mellow though. The guys stay professional for most of the song, and Vidal even tries to mime the organ solo despite having no apparent piano playing experience. But then... Gotta be one of my favourite instances of a band reacting to having to mime on a TV appearance. It's gotta be the most underrated instance, at least. The album's opening track, Right About Time, sounds much more similar to the first album though, which is a little interesting because all of the original music on the first album was written by Åhlund, but this song's written by Vidal instead. I suppose they made it the opener to ease fans of their earlier stuff into the rest of the album.
And you know it's right about time.
But things start going haywire immediately after that first track, as the sublime melody of Åhlund's Subhuman Girl is almost drowned out by a filthy wah guitar and a cacophony of echoing sounds. So as well as perhaps leaning more into the psychedelic aspects than the garagey aspects, Cherry Kicks also opens itself up more to the broader indie rock world. That includes flirting with noise rock on Subhuman Girl and Vidal's Crackin' Up. Another peppy love song but with an undercurrent of deep growling guitar fuzz. Outside of those two tracks, the album generally draws from softer indie influences. One Good Night is a fairly driving but mid-tempo track, with the keyboards alternating between the band's trademark Farfisa sound and Mellotron flutes. Then Since You've Been Gone and the closing title track are closer to dream pop in their atmospheres and laid-back delivery. Things get a little bit more punky on tracks like Spill Your Guts and From the Bug House, but with the album's more overall light-hearted approach to melody, it's punk in pretty much exclusively the Ramones sense. But the Ramones were still punk, even if they weren't the most abrasive band under that umbrella. In fact, one of the songs on this album is called Punk Rocker. And yeah, there's probably a reason why that name sounds familiar to you. So while some parts of the world may best know Joakim Åhlund for his work with Caesars, in Sweden he's probably best known as the bass guitarist for Teddy Bears, the band responsible for Punk Rocker featuring Iggy Pop. The year that Caesar's Palace formed was also the year that Teddy Bears dropped their debut album, on which they sounded a bit more like typical punk rockers. After hearing one or more songs from that debut Teddy Bears album, renowned heavy metal guitarist Yngwie Malmsteen remarked that the band, sucks anal, and then proceeded to saw their CD in half. Iggy Pop didn't record Punk Rocker with Teddy Bears until 2006. The earlier version, sung by Teddy Bears lead vocalist Patrick Arve, appeared on the third Teddy Bears album Rock and Roll High School. Though interestingly, that album debuted on the Swedish chart 3 months after Cherry Kicks did. So this might be one of those cases where the original version of a song is officially released after one of its cover versions. Or possibly 2 covers in this case, because they did a version of the song with a Swedish rapper called Hip Hopper, and that debuted on the Swedish chart the week before Rock and Roll High School did. Now musically, punk rocker has generally come off sounding like if the Cars got really into Noi. But the Caesar's Palace version leans a little bit more into the krautrock aspects. And there's a bit more fucking around with vocal echoes, similar to other tracks on Cherry Kicks. Whilst Caesar's Palace recorded the song at a faster tempo, it manages to be about 2 minutes longer than most of the Teddy Bears versions of punk rocker. So if you're not fully on board with this version of the song, then it might start to drag a bit towards the end. Cherry Kicks also has a song called Only You, which I think was only released as a promotional single, but the band did shoot a music video for it, featuring the members eating knitted meat and a leprechaun, I guess. I reckon this song definitely had potential to be the band's breakout hit before Jerk It Out. It's got a fairly clean indie rock sound overall, a simple but catchy lead guitar riff, great vocal harmonies as usual. A quirky music video, and another surprisingly memorable set of lyrics, declaring love for someone despite their many peculiarities. It's like You're My Favourite, but with the good ending. The album got even more potential for success thanks to being co-released by Virgin Records as well as Dolores Recordings. At least it would have given them more potential if they bothered to release the album outside of Sweden. The only export this album got was via a minuscule indie label in the Benelux region. Supposedly, this album was also going to get a US release in 2002 via an even more well-known indie label, Sub Pop, but for whatever reason that didn't materialise. Still, it put Caesar's Palace in the Swedish top 20 albums for the first time, and Åhlund claims 2 years later that the album had sold 25,000 copies in total. 2 years later, Caesar's Palace dropped their third album, Love for the Streets. I think the band's philosophy when making this album must have been something like, don't bore us, get to the chorus. The longest track on the album is just over 4 minutes, and that's one of only 3 songs on the album that runs for longer than 3 minutes. Any trace of angst or venom in the vocals is just completely gone. Even the songs where they sing about breakups are sung and harmonised in the most gloriously sunshiny, earwormy fashion. In fact, maybe earworm is underselling it a bit. Some of these are like ear caterpillars. Love for the Streets is still propulsive and ramshackle enough to not completely betray the band's earlier albums, but there aren't as many moments on this album where the instruments potentially upstage the vocals. So the overall style of the album is psychedelic power pop with vague punk tinges. And then there's Jerk It Out. Yes, we finally got into that part of the story. Åhlund was inspired by hearing various old soul records in after-hours clubs in Stockholm to write something that was a bit closer to one of those old rock and roll songs about a hit new dance craze. So just to get this out of the way already, no, jerking it out is not a sex thing, and it's most likely not a reference to tweaking out on drugs either. The core meaning of the song is to just relieve your stress by letting loose on the dance floor. The song stands out quite a bit on Love for the Streets, not just for being the only song about dancing, but also by trading a more raw rhythmic feel for a shuffling beat that almost sounds like it was just an isolated drum break from an early funk song that they looped underneath everything else. Being their danciest song yet, and a song that Åhlund seems to have had a lot of faith in from the get-go, Jerk It Out was Love for the Streets' lead single. The album's second single was Over For It Started, possibly the band's first pure power pop song. And its third single, Candy Cane, wasn't too dissimilar from Over For It Started, though it features what sounds like a glockenspiel part, and overall has noticeably less of an edge than the first 2 singles. Those singles were all written by Åhlund alone, but Vidal also contributes 2 songs of his own to the album, and also wrote the music for 3 additional tracks that Åhlund co-wrote the lyrics for. Vidal's musical contributions include Cheap Glue, which with a slightly different arrangement and a bit more polish, could potentially be passed off as a Mamas and the Papas song. As well as She Don't Mind, with a strong but simple chorus in the vein of pre-Rubber Soul Beatles. She don't mind. So while Åhlund and Vidal weren't writing significantly different songs from each other on this album, I think Vidal gravitates towards the more old-fashioned songwriting a bit. A few of Åhlund's other songs for the album, like 15 Minutes Too Late and Black Heart, which has another one of my favourite lyrics of theirs,
She's got a black heart. Say she's got a black heart. You know that it's my favorite color.
echo the grittiness of Youth is Wasted on the Young a bit more, but again, the noticeably brighter vocal lines make these songs unmistakably different from the first album. The mostly acoustic track, Burn the City Down, sounds like Åhlund trying to write his own equivalent of Fun and Games, albeit overlaid with some more watery keyboards.
Burn the whole city down.
And Vidal's I Gun For You is the track that follows on from Cherry Kicks' noisiest influences the most, with probably the murkiest sounding mix on all of these songs, and also bringing back the wah guitar in a slightly more subtle fashion.
And you mess me up and you run me down.
Another fun fact about this album is that the Farfisa parts were generally played by the Bjorn from Peter, Bjorn and John, a band that would have an indie crossover hit of their own in a few years' time with Young Folks. Interestingly, none of the official band members are credited with playing keyboards or organ on the album, but some of the tracks that have audible keyboard or organ parts don't have any additional musicians credited, including Jerk It Out. So who actually played that famous organ riff on the original recording?
Boy, I really hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
Anyways, after Jerk It Out peaked at number 32 on the Swedish singles chart, Love for the Streets debuted at number 3 on the Swedish album chart. The band also earned a nomination for Best Album at the 2003 Swedish Grammys. Now, the write-ups that I've found about César's online often mention that Love for the Streets won the Swedish Grammy for Best Album. However, the winner of the Swedish Grammy for Best Album in 2003 was actually the band Kent, who I believe have won 16 Swedish Grammys in total, including 4 for Best Album alone. I also saw multiple write-ups claiming that Caesar's Palace won the Swedish Grammy for Best New Artist, but they were never even nominated in that category at any point. I can't blame anyone for getting this wrong though, because it appears to have originated from a write-up on Caesar's own website. But I think this was written by a label rep rather than the band themselves. And I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they meant to write Swedish Grammy Award nomination, but just forgot to put that word in. Anyway, Grammy Award or not, Love for the Streets was Caesar's Palace's first true breakthrough in Sweden. And yet, despite being another album co-released by Virgin Records, it never got any sort of physical release outside of their home country. Not even on a small indie label this time. It apparently wasn't until Caesar's Palace's manager played their music for higher-ups at Virgin that the label started to meaningfully acknowledge the band. In March 2003, the band embarked on their first tour of the US, supporting fellow Swedish band The Soundtrack of Our Lives. And yeah, this is the point where they dropped the Palace from their name. Ironically, in a later interview, Åhlund claims that he wishes he grew up in the 60s, while also saying that he preferred the shortened band name of Caesars because it sounded very 60s. Makes you wonder why they didn't go with that name in the first place. Anyways, in April 2003, Caesars shipped their second ever release to the US, and their first to Japan, Canada, and Europe as a whole. Perhaps unfortunately, the release in question wasn't Love for the Streets, but a compilation of various earlier songs of theirs, only one of which was from Love for the Streets, that being Jerk It Out. Meanwhile, 6 of this compilation's tracks were from Youth is Wasted on the Young, and another one was the B-side of I'm Gonna Kick You Out. So more than half of this compilation was recorded in the 90s. Also, did the drummer co-write You're My Favourite or not? Now, a compilation of old songs had done fairly well for fellow Swedish garage rockers The Hives, and the debut of The Hives' second album on the US Billboard 200 in 2002 happened 2 whole years after the album's original release. Plus, Kick You Out had only just been used in a Smirnoff Ice commercial, and Caesars were still performing their older songs live. So 39 Minutes of Bliss might not be quite as ill-conceived as I initially thought. But it's funny to me that someone apparently said, hey, you know which song of theirs is going to really help them break through into the international market? Susie Cream Cheese! Jerk It Out managed to make its UK chart debut in 2003, but 39 Minutes of Bliss didn't chart anywhere in the world as far as I can tell. Their proper American breakthrough would have to wait for a little while longer until reviewers stopped comparing them to bloody Smash Mouth. But one person in America that heard 39 Minutes of Bliss was a supposed former radio DJ turned Apple employee, who pitched Jerk It Out as a song to soundtrack one of their iPod commercials. Apple went along with the pitch, and Jerk It Out subsequently had its biggest resurgence of all. It had taken this song 3 years to finally become an international hit, and in the days before streaming and TikTok, I don't think that was a particularly common occurrence. Going back in time a bit, César began recording their fourth studio album in winter 2003. The recording was a leisurely process, starting in a remote Swedish studio located in the middle of a forest, before moving to Stockholm's Decibel Studios, and then wrapping up in a studio that Åhlund co-founded himself along with his younger brother Klaas. The final mixing for the album was started in fall 2004. Whilst the release of another Teddy Bears album would have taken up a lot of Åhlund's focus in 2004 as well, the making of this album was at least a 9-month process. And the album hadn't even released by the time Jerk It Out debuted in that iPod Shuffle commercial. In February 2005, the band finally dropped We Got to Leave, the lead single from their next album. That album was called Paper Tigers, and it dropped in April 2005, shortly after the release of its second single, Jerk It Out. Okay, it's certainly not unheard of for a band to release the same song on 2 different studio albums, though usually the second release of the song tends to be a re-recording. This was not the case with Jerk It Out. However, most of Paper Tigers was mixed by American industry veteran Michael Brower, and he also contributed what would be labelled the New Brower mix of Jerk It Out. But when they shipped Paper Tigers to the UK, they just put the original mix of Jerk It Out on there, and the single reached its peak of number 8 in the UK that year, so they probably didn't even need Brower's new mix in the first place. In fact, you know what song the UK version got as a bonus track? I'm Gonna Kick You Out, which was nearly a decade old at this point. But I think the band themselves were on board with that decision because they even shot a new music video for the song that year. There was a bigger problem inherent when it came to shoehorning Jerk It Out onto this album to try and sell more copies. In this interview from February 2005, Åhlund remarked that he felt the songs for the previous album were a bit too fast to regularly play live, and as a result he happened to be more in the mood for tired old man rock. Do tired old men run circles around people and chase cars up and down the avenue? I should probably chill out a bit though, because all of that doesn't ruin Paper Tigers as an album. In fact, the album's still quite good. It just feels like it should be better than it ultimately is. Beyond the increased production value and the slight decrease in musical intensity, Paper Tigers doesn't significantly evolve the band's sound for the most part. One notable exception is the opening track, Spirit, where melodically repeating verses are backed by music that gradually crescendos into something fairly bombastic, complete with added orchestral instruments. This was actually the first song that Nino Keller co-wrote for the band, and whilst Åhlund helped with the lyrics, Keller actually wrote the music himself, so that may explain why Spirit sounds a bit different from the rest of the album. Most of Paper Tigers was written by Åhlund alone, with the exception of Out There, a Vidal composition, Throwaway, mostly written by Vidal with Åhlund assisting on the lyrics, and My Heart Is Breaking Down, the third cover in a trilogy of songs from the 60s by largely forgotten bands. The first being Susie Cream Cheese, and the second being Out of My Hands by The End, which originally appeared on the B-side of Kick You Out and then on 39 Minutes of Bliss. This latest cover was by the Max Group, who only ever put out the one single in 1969. I don't know how Stockholm record shops were getting all of these mega deep cuts from the 60s, but there you go. The problem with Åhlund writing most of the music on Paper Tigers himself is that it kind of feels like he's just going through the motions at times. And if you're mostly covering ground that you've already covered before, then you need to find a way to make it really engaging. That isn't to say that these songs aren't engaging, or really bad at all by any means, but when you're used to hearing a singer or an artist delivering one killer hook after another, then even their just slightly less amazing hooks might start to feel a bit mediocre. Truly though, the only mediocre song on Paper Tigers in my opinion is My Heart Is Breaking Down. And to be fair, they didn't write the song, but also to be fair, they still chose to cover it.
Hear the thunder rolling by, the rivers and saw the tears you cried. My heart is breaking down.
This is a style of old-fashioned songwriting that just doesn't really gel with the more modern aspects of the album at all. But back to more positivity. Out There and promotional single It's Not the Fall That Hurts are melodically strong, if not too musically adventurous.
I'm nowhere, you're out there.
The title track has another go at the more sprawling indie kind of songs that appeared on the second album to pretty good effect. And Winter Song is a welcome addition to the album with its mellotrons and more reverberating soundscape. Then, coming back to the album's lead single, We Got to Leave's chorus personally feels like the first moment on the album where we get the hook. The one that makes me feel like, holy shit. But on Paper Tigers, I haven't overwhelmingly gotten that feeling until the 10th track. Well, it's actually the 11th track, but I don't really count Jerk It Out as part of this album because it was already on Love for the Streets, you know. What's interesting though is that We Got to Leave didn't significantly hit for me until the third or fourth time that I heard it. So if this album doesn't do much for you initially, then don't get too discouraged to return to it later, because it definitely might be a grower. To me, this album saves the best for last, with We Got to Leave followed by the penultimate track Soul Chaser with some especially ear candy vocal parts. And then closing track, Good and Gone, is the best of the whole lot. It's one of the few César songs up to this point where I genuinely thought, wow, this is a great guitar line. The band's previous songs were so heavily reliant on chord progressions and good vocal lines that often whatever the additional guitar parts were or whatever the keyboards and drums were doing were more or less secondary. But yeah, Good and Gone has an awesome guitar part and killer vocal harmonies. I think it would genuinely make my top 10 César songs, and it's on my least favourite album of theirs. But remember, least favourite doesn't always equal bad. Some reviewers may have disagreed with that though, including Pitchfork, where this time the review was written by a guy who actually liked 39 Minutes of Bliss. Regardless, they got their first charting album in the UK and the US, albeit on the Heat Seekers chart, which albums were only eligible for if they hadn't charted in the top 200. And all this was enough for them to contribute their Don't Fear the Reaper cover to the 6 Feet Under soundtrack. It didn't appear on the show itself, just on one of the official soundtrack CDs. So this was the point where César's reached peak worldwide exposure. And in the grand scheme of things, it might not seem like that big of a peak. Plus, going back to the Swedish charts, this album basically underperformed compared to the previous two César's albums. But it may have ultimately been for the best that the album didn't get bigger than it did, because as it turns out, they got burnt out pretty hard by all the touring around this album. So much so that when they eventually reconvened to make another album, the only way that they felt that they could finish said album was to make it on their own terms. The resulting album was 2008's Strawberry Weed. It's a double album, which isn't normally something that you see from a band trying to make a big comeback. And the album's lead single was mixed by the same guy who helped mix Jerk It Out, so they may have been hoping that that song could catch on somewhat, but if they truly wanted it to catch on, then they probably would have given it a better name than Boo Boo Goo Goo. Plus, if you went to an American music shop at the time looking for the new César's album, then you would have only gotten half the songs. Europe got Strawberry Weed as a double album, Japan got it as a double album, complete with obligatory bonus tracks, and even Australia got it as a double album. But America only got a 12-track single CD version of Strawberry Weed. And if that version of the album didn't make much of a splash over there, then I don't think an additional 12 tracks would have changed people's minds. Strawberry Weed was more or less made for the diehards. In order to have fun making the album, the band turned the usual César's recording and writing process on its head. While the previous César's albums were each co-produced by Åhlund as a whole, this time he only produced just over half these tracks, with most of the remaining tracks overseen by Soundtrack of Our Lives frontman and favourite to win the Most Swedish-Looking Man award, Ebbert Lundberg. And Åhlund still contributed most of the album's lyrics, but both him and Vidal wrote the music for 9 songs each. And arguably, Vidal had the bigger musical contribution to this album, because 2 of Åhlund's songs are short interludes. Meanwhile, Nino Keller wrote the music for 7 tracks on the album, and even David Lindqvist did some co-writing. Well, he co-wrote the lyrics for 1 track, but that was only the second time it had happened, so that's kind of saying something. He does also get to do his first solo bass intro on the title track, and it's probably the band's first proper big-dicked bass line. This is also the first César's album where Vidal isn't the lead vocalist on some tracks. Instead, Åhlund takes the lead vocal on the songs You're Next and You Nailed Me, and Keller fronts the songs Tough Luck and Easy Star. And the frequent shaking up of band roles and just a general desire to have fun making music results in the album covering a pretty fair range of styles, some of which the band hadn't really dabbled in before. Tracks like Boo Boo Goo Goo and She's Getting High follow on from earlier songs like Candy Cane and Fun and Games. The album's other single, No Tomorrow, is catchy but slightly grimy in the vein of Kick You Out. And on the songs Turn It Off and In Orbit, Vidal revisits the more grungy and lo-fi style of pop songwriting that he dabbled with on the second and third César's albums. Meanwhile, opening track Fool's Parade is halfway between the band's more old-fashioned psychedelic influences and their slightly more recent indie influences like Pavement, all whilst Keller is playing the drums like he was simultaneously possessed by the spirits of John Bonham and Keith Moon. Crystal is another big retro track in the vein of the Rolling Stones at their sneeriest and bluesiest. Åhlund and Vidal even dabble with folk and country music a bit on the tracks Down, Down, Down and Run No More respectively.
Down, down, down again. I know I'll run no more.
You're Next is an acoustic, mostly piano-driven number, which combined with Åhlund's vocal performance makes it the most theatrical and almost vaudevillian César's song ever.
You know you're next.
Easy Star feels like Nino Keller's homage to early Pink Floyd, part Astronomy Domine and part Syd Barrett's solo albums.
Seasons keep slipping away.
And Keller also closes out the album's first disc with a lovely little solo keyboard piece called Selena. The ending of the second disc is quite a bit less understated though, as penultimate track New Year's Day matches the more maximalist recordings of Paper Tigers. And You Nailed Me inverts the previous album by ending things with the gradually crescendoing slow burner this time. A lot of double albums out there have some sort of overarching theme or some kind of evolving narrative, but if you're expecting that from César's at this point, then you clearly haven't been watching the video very closely. And if you're expecting this album to have another Jerk It Out on there, then you might be a bit disappointed too. Some people might not like the fact that the album goes all over the place, but to me that's one of the album's biggest strengths. It keeps things interesting, and the songwriting stays solid enough throughout, regardless of what style the band are performing in. Ultimately, the only César's album that I like slightly less than the rest of them is Paper Tigers. Strawberry Weed is still up with their best. Unsurprisingly, with the band seemingly doing the bare minimum to promote Strawberry Weed, the album didn't chart anywhere except for Sweden, where it dropped off the chart after 3 weeks. In 2017, César's did their first live performance in 8 years. Quite a few more gigs followed that one, and their main stage prop for those shows said César's Palace. So in case you've read otherwise, no, the César's Palace Casino didn't directly threaten to sue the band. Whilst there hasn't been any official announcement of César's breakup, their last reunion show to date happened in 2019, and it's been close to 20 years since the band released any new music. When Vidal was asked why César started going their separate ways after Strawberry Weed, he wasn't able to give a more satisfactory answer than, "That's just the way things happened." I can't give a more satisfactory answer than that either, but I suspect it mainly has to do with Vidal being reluctant to go back to being a career musician and or be a performer in general. He did drop a solo album in 2020, however none of the songs were newly written at the time. In fact, one of them was a new version of a song from Strawberry Weed, and in the 5 years since that album, I think his only other release has been a guest vocal on a song by a band largely unknown outside of Sweden. Compare that to Joakim Åhlund, who since 2008 has not only continued his work with Teddy Bears, but also co-wrote and co-produced songs for Kelly Clarkson,
I want you, no one else will do.
Charlie XCX, and Cheryl from Girls Aloud, namely her UK #1 single, I Don't Care.
I don't care, and it feels so fucking good to say I swear.
He's also formed and released albums as a duo with Björn Yttling, a more experimental and jazzier group with Joakim Nordstrom, who did the cover art for all of César's albums, and with his main focus of late, a psychedelic slash krautrock slash shoegaze band named Lay Big Bird for some reason. Also, back when both César's and Teddy Bears were still largely underground, he directed some Swedish music videos, including New Noise by Refused, which now has nearly 10 million views. As far as I can tell, Åhlund's never performed any César songs with any of his other bands, even though he has every right to keep performing those songs considering he wrote most of them himself. It seems like to him it'd be wrong to keep performing them without his best friend and the effective namesake of that band. Lay Big Bird are coming to Australia in support of the Brian Jonestown Massacre next year. And even after all this time, these might be the first ever Australian live shows for Åhlund and Keller, who's the drummer for Lay Big Bird. Keller released his own neoclassical solo album in 2017, then a more contemporary solo album in 2025, and he also appears to have a bit of a side hustle as an illustrator. Out of all the band members, David Lindqvist has been the least active in the music industry outside of César's, though he did release an album in 2024 as part of a project that isn't even up on Discogs yet. And Claes Åhlund was just a touring member slash session musician for César's for a few years, so I won't get into too much detail, but the fact that he has his own sub-page on Wikipedia for songs that he wrote probably tells you that he's done quite well for himself. César's might have done a bit better for themselves if they'd made a little bit more effort to promote their music beyond licensing just the one song to various forms of media. But the César's Instagram account still remains fairly active despite years going by without any live shows, which tells me that there isn't really any bad blood between these guys, and they also don't majorly regret how things turned out. Plus, look at Vidal's Instagram account. He's basically spent the last few years traveling around the world with his family. So your main takeaway from this video should be to listen to more of César's music, but you don't have to feel bad for any of them for not being bigger than they were. Also, if you're interested in buying some physical César's releases, then if I were you, I'd avoid the Busy Bee vinyl repressings of their earlier works. Because one of the guys who started Busy Bee apparently did so because he got Me Too'd from his previous label. Don't worry, there should be plenty of good secondhand options, like this signed 2-CD version of Paper Tigers, if your name happens to be Sharon. And I guess Nino Pacino thought he was too good for autographs. So I hope you enjoyed the latest edition of me hyperfixating on a relatively small band and trying to tell their entire story with what meager resources are available about them online. I haven't had to look at this many non-English articles for a video before, so yeah, that was interesting. I also talked a bit about César's in my previous video, which you might like if you're nostalgic for that early 2000s era of music in general. Thank you for watching, I hope you have a good day, go and listen to more César's, and most importantly of all, eat cheese.